This is the Resident Evil Village demo, now available on all systems for 1 week only. For some bizarre reason, we've already taken a look at the Village demo released for PlayStation 5, and this was followed up last week by a Castle demo, again exclusive for PlayStation systems. But last weekend, the demo unlocked for Xbox consoles and PC, so it's as good a chance as any to take a look at how the game runs on Microsoft machines ahead of launch, and to do some early comparison work against PlayStation 5. Suffice to say though that the final game releases this week, and we will be returning to the title in its full retail guise to showcase more of the game and to give the final word on the head-to-heads. So let's go over the basics. The Village and Castle demos are both available on all systems now, and again, for some bizarre reason, Capcom limits your time on the demo to just 1 hour, spread across both gameplay segments. I mean, it's simplicity itself just to create another user on your console and play the demo again if that's what you want, making the whole limitation thing somewhat ridiculous, but it is what it is. The Village demo is essentially a collection of engine-driven cutscenes with some traversal and basic combat linking them. The Castle demo cuts down on the cinematics and gives you some very basic exploration elements and mild puzzle solving before leading into more combat in a more enclosed environment. Pretty basic stuff actually, and based on the trailer also supplied, it's fair to say that the actual game is going to be a lot more involved than the sample that you're getting here. But it is an interesting opportunity to get to grips with the technology Capcom has deployed here, and principally how its excellent RE engine runs across the new wave of consoles. So, as you know, we've already looked at PlayStation 5. Resident Evil Village renders at a 3840 by 2160 resolution, 4K, using one of the best reconstruction techniques we've seen, perhaps based on checkerboard rendering, based on the way that transparencies and especially hair tend to resolve. Really though, bearing in mind the quality of the visuals and the low contrast in the aesthetic generally, compromises brought about by reconstruction don't really have a huge impact on image quality. There are also two options, ray tracing on, ray tracing off. Now, there were some nebulous performance targets set by Capcom and talk of a 45 FPS frame rate, but the truth is that performance is unlocked and 60 FPS is always the target. PlayStation 5 runs flat out at 60 FPS with ray tracing disabled and can drop into the 50s in select scenarios when ray tracing is turned on. What does ray tracing actually do in this game? In truth, it's not exactly a game changer. You get very low resolution RT reflections, but more interesting is how ray tracing does seem to also replace the screen space ambient occlusion pass with something with a little more fidelity that does seem to add more depth and atmosphere. With that said, it is an additive to the game. It's not a foundational part of the visual design. So if you prefer consistency in performance over fidelity, you can safely turn it off without missing too much. But, you know, it is nice and, well, it is there. So where do the Xbox Series consoles fit in then? Well, I'm actually going to start the analysis work with Xbox Series S, which I thought was going to be pretty disastrous when I first played it. You see, this is what I saw. Series S targets a 2560 by 1440 base resolution, but it does seem to be using a similar form of reconstruction to the game as it runs on PS5 and indeed Xbox Series X. As you can see though, performance, I'd categorise it as bad, but this is with ray tracing enabled. We'll talk about RT off shortly. Capcom mentions a 30 FPS performance level for this mode, when really and truly you're looking at frame rates that are unlocked in the mid-30s to mid-40s generally. Certainly in the Village part of the game I tested, there's no real consistency here and it's just poor to experience. However, on the flip side, I should say that I thought that the image quality here was rather good. A combination of decent image reconstruction, well implemented anti-aliasing with no specular or jaggy issues, and of course a decent resolution. Performance though clearly a problem. However, there is a solution here for Series S owners and it's tremendously simple. Turn off ray tracing. So in Capcom's spec sheet it talks about a 1440p image with a 45 FPS performance level with RT disabled. Certainly in this Village demo, which is the more demanding of the two gameplay segments, well, performance seems to be totally sorted here with pretty much a flat out 60 FPS throughout and only the most minor of dips. This is a bit of a relief to be honest, because the RT presentation is really choppy and highly inconsistent and I can't really recommend it at all. So yeah, keep RT disabled here, That would be my advice. I just hope to see this level of performance persisting throughout the final game. The 45 FPS stuff Capcom is talking about will hopefully only apply to the very heaviest bits of the game and not reflect the general flow of the experience. Let's move on to the Xbox Series X here, and we're looking at a reconstructed 2160p spec with ray-tracing features that are essentially a match for PlayStation 5. I ran some head-to-head comparisons and found that the game looks practically identical in terms of its rendering features. The reconstruction method also looks to be exactly the same. If we freeze frame on the character here and zoom in, you'll see the same sub-pixel breakup and minor checkerboarding artifacts. This is almost certainly a bug and certainly not noticeable outside of head-to-head comparisons, but amusingly I did note that the character's eyelashes appear to be longer on Series X. I mean, that's how much of a nitpick you need to do to show any difference at all between Series X and PS5. Ray tracing performance on Series X, thankfully it's very smooth overall, and nothing like as inconsistent as the Xbox Series S experience. You should expect 60 frames per second for the majority of the run of play, but you will find areas that drop into the 50s. Again, I can only assume that the 45 FPS Capcom describes in its spec sheet applies to heavier areas of the game we've not seen yet. But suffice to say, stacking up Series X against Series S, the X not only has a much higher resolution, but it's also running with a huge performance advantage when ray tracing is enabled. How high that advantage actually is, well, that's difficult to quantify, but here, at this scene at the beginning of the Village demo, well, Series X drops a little bit beneath its performance target in the high 50s, but meanwhile, Series S languishes in the mid-30s, even with that significant resolution deficit. I think I understand now why Capcom opted not to enable RT features on the Series S version of Devil May Cry 5 Special Edition. Going back to Series X, well, if Series S runs nigh on flawlessly at 60 FPS when RT is disabled, it should come as no surprise to see that the X does it too, this time at 2160p. Whether you're playing the castle demo or the technically more demanding village segment, you will have no problems hitting the frame rate cap here. In this sense, RT off mode on Series X is a carbon copy of the experience as I played it on PlayStation 5. But what about head-to-heads with ray tracing on? Well, dips from 60, a few and far between in the castle demo, but you can find some interesting comparison points in the village, and the first is right at the beginning of the game. Series X runs flat out at 60 with just minor fluctuations beneath on PS5, but as the segment plays out, the Microsoft machine has a few dropped frames of its own to contend with, and there you can see the delta between PS5 and Series X in matched content. And there's not much to separate them, to be honest. That said, at best, Series X has a 9 to 10% performance advantage, similar to the kind of thing we saw in Devil May Cry 5 Special Edition with RT enabled. This combat in the long grass is not synchronized between the two consoles, but it does seem to indicate a small level of extra performance on Series X. And it's the same in this fiery cutscene here. Just a bit more overhead on the Microsoft console, meaning a tighter lock to target performance levels. One thing I did note though, identical performance in this scene towards the end of the Village demo, so I will be interested to see how everything shakes out across the more challenging content in the final game. Ultimately though, if we look at the performance differential between Series S, RT on and off, it seems to me that the hit from RT is pretty heavy, and that Series X and PlayStation 5 with RT disabled are seeing 60 frames per second being delivered with a ton of overhead likely to spare. But that's all I've really got to say now about Resident Evil Village based on the demo, which, as I mentioned earlier, well, I'm not sure how representative of the final game it is when the trailers are all suggesting something much more varied and dynamic, but in the here and now at least, it's nice to see what the strengths and weaknesses of the RE engine are, and finally we can get to see what happens with RE's RT feature set on Series S. But that's all from me for now. Please do like, subscribe and share if you enjoyed the content, and ring the bell for instant notifications whenever DF drops new videos. We've also just relaunched our Patreon, so check that out for an improved download version of this video with significantly better image quality, and you'll also get access to our brilliant Discord and a ton of behind the scenes material. But that's all from me for now. Thanks for watching and supporting Digital Foundry.